Hello, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Rams History. Today's topic is the Northern Renaissance and the development of national monarchies. Now, the Italian Renaissance, of course, began in Italy and then gradually spread to the rest of Europe through travel and trade and also the printed word. So we'll look at how the Renaissance impacted some other parts of Europe today. And one of the main questions you might come across is, how did the Northern Renaissance differ from the Italian Renaissance? What sort of set them apart? Well, essentially, the Northern Renaissance had more of a Christian character to it. Remember that the Italian Renaissance was largely secular. It was concerned with sort of worldly affairs. And the church sort of had an influence, but not nearly as great as it would in the Northern Renaissance. The Northern Renaissance had much more of a Christian character, certainly, than the Italian Renaissance did. Another difference of the Northern Renaissance versus the Italian Renaissance was in its focus. The Northern Renaissance focused a great deal upon social reform, sort of in the sense of how can we make things better for everyone. Sir Thomas More, for example, was a great proponent of social reform. The Italian Renaissance, on the other hand, had that humanist outlook sort of upon the individual. You know, we speak, for example, of the Renaissance man, sort of how to make each person a better person. So again, there was a difference there between the religious versus secular, as well as the sort of group influence versus the individual influence. Now, of course, those are the contrasts. How do they compare? Well, there are some similarities between the Northern Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance as well. For example, both the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance are based upon humanism. All right, this concept of human beings and sort of a celebration of the human condition. Additionally, they also have that humanistic impulse to look back to original texts, so the idea of looking back to the antiquity, Greek, Roman, and biblical texts in particular. So just as Petrarch, for example, was collecting ancient manuscripts and transcribing them, so, for example, would Erasmus in the Northern Renaissance. Now, speaking of Erasmus, we really can't discuss the Northern Renaissance without mentioning him. He was from the Netherlands. He lived in Rotterdam, and he is considered to be one of the greatest of the humanist figures in the Northern Renaissance. Now, he accomplished a great deal in his life. He wrote a book called The Praise of Folly. Folly was a character in his book. She was raised by inebriation and ignorance. And he kind of uses folly as a form of social satire. In particular, he sort of pokes some criticisms at the church. For example, Folly makes a comment in the book that she went to a religious dispute. She is often there. So you get it? Folly's often at religious disputes. Now, Erasmus was a critic of the church. He did feel that the church had room for improvement, but he remained a loyal Catholic. He never did side with Martin Luther during the Reformation, which broke out during his lifetime. And he really felt that the best way to improve the church was from within. So he certainly did not approve of Luther and some of the changes he was making. Now, like a true humanist, he felt that we had to look back to the ancient sources. He thought that the true essence of Christianity could be found in the original texts. So, for example, he would collect ancient manuscripts of the Bible and things and transcribe them. One of the accomplishments of which he was most proud was to write a new Greek version of the Bible. He took ancient manuscripts and he rewrote them into Greek. And in addition to Greek, he also did a version in Latin. Now, one of his big criticisms of the Bible was that the Latin was rather poor. The edition that was in common use was called the Latin Vulgate, sort of vulgar Latin, sort of the Latin of the common people. And Erasmus felt that if we're going to have the Bible, it should be written in the best Latin possible. So he wrote, for example, "It's only fair that Paul should address the Romans in somewhat better Latin." So in addition to writing a Greek version of the New Testament, he also writes a very polished Latin version as well. I'll give you an example of what Erasmus was getting at. On the right-hand side there, we have an image of St. Peter. St. Peter was the very first pope, the vicar of Christ. You'll notice in the image he's holding a key. That key is the kingdom to heaven. It's what Jesus gave him. Essentially, he became Christ's representative on earth, and every pope since that time has fulfilled that position. Now notice in the painting how St. Peter is portrayed. He's on a throne and he's very elaborately dressed. He's got jewelry and robes, and of course his attendants there are quite elaborately dressed as well. This is what many people saw when they looked at the church in Erasmus's time, a church that was obsessed with wealth and prosperity. Now if you look to the other side of your screen there, you'll see an image of St. Peter from much earlier. This, I believe, is probably a Byzantine image, but notice that it's a much plainer St. Peter. He's not wealthy. He's not at all concerned with, robes and jewelry. He's just basically a common man. And this is how Erasmus believes St. Peter truly was. So how do we find the true nature of St. Peter? Well, we look back to the Bible to see how he was originally meant to be. Now, sometimes they say that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Remember that Erasmus really didn't approve of Luther. He felt the church should be improved from within. But Erasmus did, of course, lay that foundation of criticizing the church for its abuses. And some say that Luther sort of took Erasmus to the next level, that he took those criticisms and then he did something about them. So again, Erasmus and Luther never agreed. In fact, they quite publicly disagreed on many things, but in some ways it was Erasmus's criticisms of the church that made Luther possible. Another great Northern Renaissance thinker, Sir Thomas More. Now, he was English, and in fact, he was an advisor to King Henry VIII. He wrote a book called Utopia. Now, utopia is a little bit of a play on words. It actually means no place. So, in a sense, no place is perfect. But Utopia was intended as a satire to sort of point out some of the flaws in English society. So, for example, in Utopia, they talk about crime. And someone mentions how in his country, criminals are executed as they were in England. So, for example, someone steals a loaf of bread, they are put to death, and that is meant to sort of stop crime. The ambassador from Utopia replies that instead of hanging criminals, wouldn't it be better to make sure everyone has enough to eat? So Sir Thomas More uses Utopia as a way to criticize contemporary English society of his day. Now, unfortunately for Sir Thomas More, he, like so many others, ran afoul of Henry VIII. He believed that he was a good servant to the king, but he also felt that he was God's servant first. Henry VIII, as you recall, got into a lot of different adventures, especially with women. He wanted to divorce his wife to marry Anne Boleyn, believing she would provide him with a male heir. Sir Thomas More did not approve of this divorce. And then, of course, later, Henry VIII passed what was called the Act of Supremacy, in which he made himself the head of the Anglican Church. He essentially abandons the Pope and makes himself the head of the Church. This was too much for Sir Thomas More, who felt that the Pope should be respected. And when Sir Thomas More refused to attend the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn, he pretty much became a marked man. He was charged with crimes. He was put on trial, and then he was beheaded in 1535. So he sort of ran afoul of Henry, and that was the end of his life. But Sir Thomas More remains to this day one of the great thinkers of the Northern Renaissance. And of course, we can't discuss the Northern Renaissance without discussing the movable type printing press invented by Johann Gutenberg. Printing used to be quite laborious. It was a matter of sort of transcribing every page by hand. The same with illustrations. Now, Gutenberg takes the printing press and he essentially takes movable type. So instead of having to write out an entire page, essentially you could simply move the type around in different combinations to make new words, and then you could print a page and then simply move the type again to print another page and another. So this makes the process of printing books much less labor intensive and much more cost effective, and this has several major impacts on Europe. All right, first of all, the printing press combined with cheaper sources of paper, right? You begin to see literacy rates really increase. The number of people who can read and write skyrockets. Additionally, you have ideas being spread more quickly, right? For example, the ideas of the Renaissance spread very quickly through the printed word. So this is a major, major increase in the ability of Europeans to transfer ideas across time and space. Let's just talk a little bit about some of the changes happening to monarchies at the time. Now remember, as the Middle Ages come to an end, we have a trend toward the creation of nation states, and that continues, of course, during the Renaissance. A lot of factors back during the Middle Ages sort of kept kings from becoming too powerful. Of course, nobles had a great deal of power. Nobles often had rights. Nobles had castles, which allowed them to defend themselves. Towns. Many towns had charters, which gave them certain specific rights. Towns also had walls to defend themselves, which made them very difficult to attack. And finally, of course, the church. The church was hugely powerful, had many rights and protections of its own, and of course the church had tremendous influence over political affairs, especially the affairs of kings. Now, during the time of the Renaissance, a lot of those obstacles began to be overcome, and we start to see the rise of national monarchies. For example, kings began to develop national armies. This was something that had started during the 100 Years' War and continued. So kings now have a means to control their subjects and also to make war upon their neighbors. Kings began to develop efficient means of taxation, so they could raise the revenue that was required in order to finance their governments and their policies. Additionally, too, you began to see the development of national bureaucracies, right? Especially as literacy rates increased, kings began to have workers who could represent them throughout their kingdoms, making sure that the law was applied and that taxes were collected. And these national bureaucracies really helped kings to administer these new modern nation states. So kings gradually get control over their nations and overcome some of these obstacles that had been in the way. The church, for example, starts to weaken. Obviously, the Reformation had a major impact on that. So as the church weakens, kings are able to gain more power at its expense. A couple examples here. Of course, Ferdinand and Isabella, they were from the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. They married, creating a very powerful kingdom. And they were able to accomplish much. Now, some of it was good, some of it perhaps not. Spain had been an example of religious toleration. You had Muslims, Jews, and Christians living side by side more or less in harmony. Under Ferdinand and Isabella, that came to an end. The Muslims and Jews were largely driven out of the country or forced to convert to Christianity. Now, it also had some positive effects in a sense that, for example, Ferdinand and Isabella sponsored Christopher Columbus, and he began his voyage of discovery, which would eventually lead to Europe's discovery of the New World. But Ferdinand and Isabella are sort of the example of a power couple, right? The two together, stronger than they were apart. Over in England, we also have the development of a national monarchy, but there was a bit of controversy first, the Wars of the Roses. As you recall, the 100 Years' War ended in 1453. That's followed in England by about another 30 years of conflict between two competing branches of the royal family, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. House of York was represented by a white rose and Lancaster by a red rose, so hence the Wars of the Roses. The essential nature of the struggle is who would become the next king. Would it be the House of York or the House of Lancaster? Now, unfortunately for the House of York, the Lancastrians are successful, The final English king, or the final Yorkist king, Richard III, was killed at a battle called Bosworth Field in 1485. In fact, not too long ago, his skeleton was discovered beneath a parking lot. There's some information there about what they learned. And Richard would become the last Yorkist king, and he would be replaced by a Lancastrian, Henry Tudor, who would later go on to become Henry VII and found the Tudor dynasty, which would rule England for quite a while, all the way up until Elizabeth I. So the Tudors would rule England for well over a century, establishing themselves as the royal family of England. Of course, there were some exceptions to this creation of national monarchies. Italy remained a fragmented political mess, and the Holy Roman Empire, what today we would largely call Germany, likewise remained divided and hopelessly fragmented. And in fact, both of these areas would sort of withstand unification until the middle of the 19th century. All right, ladies and gentlemen, some questions here for you to ponder. So we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Rams History, and we'll see you again soon.